Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, December 19th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in three-quarters of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. Since at least the end of the 19th century, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of the world by the American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, the Second World War, conquering their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone in 1941, so the U.S. could concentrate on Japan. In World War II as a whole, the U.S. had 500,000 casualties, but Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in defeating Nazi Germany. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia, Russia and China, and retarding its economic development. The American task is more difficult today than at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China and their alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's why the U.S. has 1,000 military bases around Russia and China, while Russia has 15 bases outside its own territory, and China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. U.S. government plans were described by the State Department policy planning staff in a secret memorandum that pointed out that, quote, we have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. Close quote. That's what the U.S. said of its policy after the Second World War. Our immediate national objectives since World War II have been economic control of the world. For most of my life, that was presented as a struggle with Russian communism. But we weren't told that the communist bloc never controlled an economy more than half the size that of the U.S. From World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting, Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program in modern times. but once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war, still going on. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa, the Middle East, gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. The U.S. has been at war almost continuously since World War II, putting down challenges to its economic control of the world. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia and China. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the more than 1,000 U.S. military bases ringing Russia and China. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons and make them more usable. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which of course represent the views of the American political establishment and are in the business of manufacturing consent to those views from you. We'll try to give a better account tonight, and we'll start with a note on the notion of neoconservatism. We speak often here about the neocons as a party at American government, some in the government, some outside the government, some in the media, television and newspapers, as well as other forms of communication. But it's essentially an elite opinion of the American political establishment. The neocons are the war party, those who think that the U.S. should be using its military force, as it is around the world, to attack and kill people in countries that we don't approve of. That's what's going on, even though most Americans are not aware of it. And there are people in the government and in the media who are very much in favor of it. We speak of them as neoconservatives. Modern American political parties, and I don't mean Republicans and Democrats, I mean parties like the neocons, the war party, arose in the 1970s when the U.S. political establishment, the spokespeople for the rich, the 1%, decided it was necessary to strike back at the dangerous political ideas that grew up in America in the 1960s, especially in regard to the use of American wealth and American military power. And we speak of these counterattacks by spokespeople for the rich as respectively neoliberalism and neoconservatism. There are identifiable neoconservative groups from the 70s who spoke up for the use of military power in a more vigorous fashion, i.e. attacking other countries. One of the best known of the neocons of that generation a man called Michael Ledeen, who was associated with the American Enterprise Institute. Ledeen said every 10 years or so, the United States needs to pick up some small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall just to show the world we mean business. Well, he didn't mean a pun on business, but he was right in using that term because it was, in fact, American business interests that led to the military adventures that included such things as the Clinton administration's attack on Yugoslavia and the expansion of wars in the Middle East that began with that administration as well. What we're looking at overall is a phenomenon now specified in the United States of America, but that's been commented on by political writers for generations. In 1915, in the midst of the First World War, the Irish revolutionary James Connolly pointed out in an article on resisting conscription, the draft for the war in Europe, he pointed out one great source of the strength of the ruling class has ever been their willingness to kill in defense of their power and privileges. Let their power be once attacked either by foreign foes or domestic revolutionists, and at once we see the rulers prepared to kill and kill and kill. The readiness of the ruling class to order killing, the small value the ruling classes ever set upon human life, is in marked contrast to the reluctance of all revolutionists to shed blood. Close quote. That's James Connolly writing in 1915, and in fact, after the end of the First World War, there was a general European and American revulsion against the war that had broken out in the first years of the 20th century. In order to get the United States to enter the Second World War, the Roosevelt administration had to work very hard to overcome that reluctance to be involved in foreign wars. They managed it, and after the Second World War, the U.S. went on to wars in Asia in order to maintain its control of the world at large. In recent years, the question of American wars has been bound up with this question of the overall American control of the world economy. In recent years, there have been some interesting changes. The Bernie Sanders campaign for president rejected the neoliberal and neoconservative notions that had grown up in the previous years and reintroduced the word socialism into American political discourse. That's quite remarkable. I would not have expected that a few years ago. But even Bernie Sanders didn't reject neoconservatism, that is, the American war-making that characterized the Obama administration. He supported American wars in the Middle East and supported America's support for human rights violators like Saudi Arabia and Israel. Donald Trump, during the campaign for president, criticized both neoconservative and neoliberal positions, but in office has adopted them. The wars in the Middle East continue, and it's hard to distinguish what the Trump administration is doing from the war-making that the Obama administration was doing. All of this is supported by a mythology about American war that really needs to be criticized and dismantled. Last week on this program, we spent some time talking about the Cold War as fake news, perhaps the greatest example of fake news. The Cold War was the worldwide political and economic program conducted by the United States on the premise that Russia was about to attack Europe or the United States. Defense against Russia was the justification for the maintenance of the wartime controls, political and economic, that had grown up during the Second World War itself. That Cold War mythology it was false. Russia never threatened either Europe or the United States in that way, with the possible exception of the development of nuclear weapons, where, for defensive purposes, the Soviet Union constructed its own nuclear armaments in response to what the United States had done after the Second World War. The United States remains the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons in wartime. All of this is based in part on the American political mythology that grew out of the Second World War. That mythology holds that the United States rose up and defeated Hitler, and then defeated Tojo, defeated Japan, and that this was done in defense of peace and freedom and justice. Little of that is true, and a general understanding of what the U.S. was doing in the Second World War would be worthwhile, because it would destroy those notions that exist about the United States war making, that it's done in favor of defense and peace. There is a very good article by the author of the best study of the coming of the Second World War, a book entitled Human Smoke, The Beginnings of World War II and the End of Civilization. And the article appears on the AWARE Facebook page. It's entitled Why I Am a Pacifist, The Myth of the Second World War. Nicholson Baker is the author. He's a novelist by trade, but he has in fact outdone the historians of the Second World War in these remarkable publications. I recommend a piece, too long to read here, that appears on the AWARE Facebook page. Some of this mythology, which we heard again from Mrs. Clinton in the last presidential election, was upended a bit this week when the Kremlin revealed that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, thanked President Trump for a CIA tip on bombings. There's apparently a plot for terrorist bombings in St. Petersburg, and the CIA found out about it and tipped off the Russians. The Trump administration communicated what the CIA had found to the Russian government, and the Russian government publicly thanked the Trump administration for this heads up. The Mueller probe and Russiagate are designed primarily to prevent the sort of cooperation between the U.S. and Russia that Donald Trump talked about during the campaign, and of which this is a remarkable example. The conversation, the phone conversation between Trump and Putin that included information on this bombing was the second between the Russian and U.S. presidents since last week, when Trump thanked Putin for his remarks acknowledging America's strong economic performance, according to the White House. 2 calls in a week between the presidents of Russia and the U.S., and that flies in the face of the attempt by the American political establishment to break up the attempt to do a deal with Russia that Donald Trump advertised during the campaign. During the first call, they also discussed ways to work together to address North Korea's nuclear and ballistic weapons program, and the cooperation between Trump and Putin on these matters brings charges of treason in the United States and the whole Russiagate probe. This is madness, and it's not an accident. It's the American political establishment trying to make sure that Trump doesn't depart from the war provocations against Russia and China that has been a staple of American foreign policy for more than a generation. The CIA gesture tipping off the Russians about this plot indicates the fact that there is a thaw in American-Russian relations, regardless of what Mueller and the Russiagate people can do. In the recent annals of Russian-American relations, it's difficult to recall a precedent for the Kremlin leader calling his White House counterpart to convey his personal gratitude and appreciation for the profound contribution made by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and its director to Russian national security. That's what Putin did this past week. There aren't many other examples. The great irony is that the incumbent Kremlin boss is a former KGB officer. Vladimir Putin never ceases to surprise. The Kremlin readout of Putin's phone call to U.S. President Donald Trump on Sunday should be an eye-opener to anyone who bought the U.S. propaganda that Putin is a demon preparing to devour the West. I heard this from a very intelligent person that I met at the anti-tax rally this last week, and I couldn't believe that people of her perspicacity were repeating this same nonsense. Countries like Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, and Venezuela and North Korea should take particular note that the world situation and the emerging international order are a lot more complicated than some among them would like to think. What prompted Putin to make such an extraordinary move? For a start, the Kremlin senses that the investigation into alleged Russian interference in the U.S. election last November, is meandering aimlessly and may have to be wound up sooner rather than later. That being the case, a future is conceivable in which the tidal wave of Russophobia in the U.S. recedes, leaving behind much devastation and debris, but also the opportunity to begin rehabilitation and reconstruction. Most certainly, Putin understood the great symbolism and meaning behind the gesture by the CIA to pass on crucial intelligence relating to the security of his hometown. Putin is from St. Petersburg, the city of his heart's desires and the pride of all Russian people. It all seems very much like strangers in the night exchanging glances. The key lies in interpreting the CIA's gesture. The CIA signaled that it's once again viewing Russia as an interlocutor in professional terms, and that in its estimation all is soon going to be business as usual. This may or may not be true. I mean, the CIA has been a center for opposition to Trump and Trump's attempt to do a deal with Russia and China, and that's why it's all the more surprising that this deal, or aspects of this deal, should seem to emerge from cooperation between the CIA and the Russian government in this last week. The amazing part, of course, is that the CIA simply ignored the Obama administration's sanctions against Russia. The war provocations against Russia and sanctions came from the Obama administration, quietly and in Obama fashion, but much more vigorously even than earlier administrations. Putin has promised Trump that the Kremlin will remember this noble gesture, and that if God forbid the occasion arose, the FSB will reciprocate. The FSB is the Russian equivalent to the CIA. Is it possible the CIA acted on its own, i.e. that this wasn't a decision of the Trump administration as a whole? We don't know what channel the CIA used, but Putin seems aware that Mike Pompeo, the CIA's director, took the decision. This is particularly striking because Pompeo has been a spokesperson for the most vicious anti-Russian comments and opposition to Trump's attempt to talk about doing deals with the Russians. The likelihood is that Pompeo spoke to the Russian ambassador, Anatoly Antonov, with Trump's approval. Putin pointedly requested Trump to pass on his words of appreciation to Pompeo personally, the head of the CIA. Many signals likely suggest that some degree of sobriety is setting in, finally, within sections of the U.S. establishment, along with the realization that Trump has been a voice of sanity all along. You can't pick up an American publication with it being told that Trump is crazy as a loon and therefore has to be replaced as president. It's an indication of sanity that he either overrode or encouraged his CIA director to pass along this important information to the president of Russia. All of this occurred so very close to Monday, the moment when President Trump was expected to unveil the new U.S. national security strategy. Oh, he did so. Didn't the CIA hear National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster condemning Russia only a week ago, naming that country as a, quote, revisionist power, close quote, that threatened the very foundations of the world order and international system that the U.S. painstakingly erected in the last century after World War II ended? See the reference earlier to the myth of the good war. Two phone conversations between Trump and Putin within 3 days resets the calculus. If the first phone call by Trump on Thursday was to thank Putin for the friendly references he made to the U.S. in his annual year-end news conference in Moscow, the call on Sunday was likewise to convey Putin's gratitude to Trump for approving Pompeo's initiative to pass on the vital intelligence regarding the impending terrorist strike in St. Petersburg. Many signals lately suggest that some degree of sobriety is setting in finally within sections of the U.S. establishment. Of course, there are negative tidings, too. Only 10 days ago, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson conjured up an image of Russia as the enemy through his three-nation European tour. And as recently as December 9th, there was an altercation between U.S. and Russian fighter planes in the skies above the Euphrates in Syria. But to be sure, the working lunch yesterday in Washington, it was Monday of this week, between U.S. Undersecretary of State Shannon and Russian Ambassador Antonov was closely watched in places as far away as Beijing for any more sounds of ice cracking, the ice in the frozen relationship between U.S. and Russia. Antonov was quoted as saying this week that the two phone conversations between Putin and Trump underscored that, quote, our countries need each other. Our countries defined a joint program of actions to strengthen global security. This is an announcement and an account of what seems to me a cloud no bigger than a man's hand in American-Russian relations this last week that actually says probably more about the attempt by the war party, by the neocons in America, to bring down the Trump administration and what the Trump administration is actually doing in this regard than anything else we've heard recently. You've been watching Aware on the Air. I have a number of other things we want to turn to, including the question of censorship on the internet. Twitter, the organization that sponsors that particularly helpful form of communication, made an interesting announcement this week, which seems to have largely flown under the radar of both the media and of Twitter's user base. It was part of a November update on Twitter's safety policies. Twitter added a crucial clause to its terms of service. It reads as follows. You, that is, a potential user of Twitter, you also may not affiliate with organizations that, whether by their own statements or activity both on and off the platform, as publicly speaking, use or promote violence against civilians to further their causes. We will begin enforcing this rule around affiliation with such organizations on December 18th, 2017, close quote. What Twitter was saying was that as of yesterday, they have instituted a policy that if you post on Twitter, you may not affiliate, you may not be involved with organizations that by speech or activity, use or promote violence against civilians to further their causes. The assertion sounds perhaps unobjectionable, except for the fact that they're talking about censorship. Given that U.S. drone assassinations alone, as practiced in this administration and the last one, are estimated to have killed 5,000 people, it's a secret program, so the U.S. government doesn't release casualty figures, most of them civilians, it would seem that anyone who affiliates with the U.S. government, which rather clearly uses or promotes violence against civilians to further its causes, will be banned from using Twitter. Now, I don't think that's what Twitter meant. They're thinking about groups like the neo-Nazi groups that demonstrated in Charlottesville, and perhaps even the Antifa groups that opposed them, as groups that use violence and therefore can't use Twitter. But their definition is broad enough to include the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, as Martin Luther King said, that is, the U.S. government. Remember that the censorship madness of America in the 1950s was practiced by good citizens who were standing up for truth, beauty, and the American way. The equivocal George Orwell had to write in the preface of his 1945 novel, Animal Farm, an attack on the Soviet Union, quote, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear," close quote. The preface to Animal Farm, which raised these political questions, was suppressed, and it's still not printed in most editions of Animal Farm. If you have an edition, go look and see if Orwell's preface is in there. We might even end up having people suppressing the sorts of things we do here. There's some good news this week, perhaps not exactly timely. The Rome, Italy City Council yesterday revoked the Emperor Augustus' direct order banning the poet Ovid from the city. It's a little late. The poet Ovid died 2,000 years ago in the year 17 or 18 A.D. He was 60 years old, and the decision by the Rome, Italy City Council came at on the motion of the Five Star Movement, Italian political movement founded by a comedian. But it isn't funny. It's on to some important issues. Whether the removal of the ban on the poet Ovid is an important issue or not, I don't know, because it does suggest something about issues of censorship. What actually happened in the first century of the Common Era is that this society poet, we might say, Publius Ovidius Naso, said something to offend the political authorities in first century Rome, and they exiled him to as far away as you could go in the Roman Empire in the first century, which was the banks of the Black Sea. Ovid himself attributed his exile to Carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. But his discretion in discussing the causes has resulted in the fact that we don't know to this day exactly what he said and whom he offended to get exiled as he was. But after 2,000 years, the exile has been removed, and Ovid, were he around, could return to Rome. Okay, the mills of the gods grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine, was quoted in another context this week, but maybe it's also true of the Rome City Council. We've said various times on this program and others like it that the poets often get there first. We usually mean that poets see things, however peculiarly, that need to be recognized by others, particularly in a political manner. I'm not sure this applies to Ovid, and getting there first in this case doesn't seem to me to mean exile in the banks of the Black Sea. But that's all gone by now, right? You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the political events of the week. The major public political event on the part of the Trump administration was a new security strategy, 55-page document based, it was said, on principled realism, a discussion of what the U.S. is doing in the world at large in regard to other countries. Trump has been promising this for a while. It's been underway since the early part of the Trump administration. But the speech that Trump gave this week announcing the publication of the document was curiously bland, as if he were reading somebody else's words. And it contrasted sharply with the event that I was talking about a moment ago, the two phone conversations with the president of Russia and the revelation by the CIA that they had tipped off Russia about a security threat to St. Petersburg. The suggestion is that the battle over American foreign policy is deeply embedded in this administration, that Trump was elected in part by his criticism of the war policy of the Obama administration, which the possible Clinton administration was clearly going to continue. It seems that that contradiction is still being fought out, even though it looks like the first year of the Trump administration included a straight-on continuation of the war policy of the Obama administration. The National Security Strategy document, published this week, describes a world locked in unceasing economic competition in which Washington has little time for things like promoting democracy, and instead will focus on great power competition, great powers being China and Russia, economic rivalry, also with China and Russia, and homeland security. That is the sort of control that the U.S. claims is necessary because of foreign threats. Outlining the document for reporters last Sunday, several administration officials called the document a dose of principled realism, that was their phrase, in a, quote, ever-competitive world. I was talking a moment ago about the notion of the neocons, the idea of the neoconservatism. The document is a thoroughly neoconservative document. Cold War is back. The document calls Russia and China revisionist powers. Revisionist means they want to change things, seeking to change the global status quo. The global status quo is a situation in which the U.S. is in charge of the world, and paints a stark picture of the world rejecting cooperation with Russia and China in favor of competition. You may think these are contradictory themes coming out of the administration this week, and you'd be right. The United States has to, quote, rethink the policies of the last 2 decades, says the new strategy document. Policies based on the assumption that engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners, the document says. For the most part, this premise turns out to be false. Cold War is back. Preemptive war, i.e. attacking these revisionist states. Asked directly how the document treats the concept of preemptive war in places like North Korea and Iran, the officials presenting it this last week were vague. One said, "We don't use the term preemption, but we will defense our national interests and values when threatened." Now, why you have to turn a noun into a verb in order to say what the U.S. is doing, the reason seems to be to avoid the announcement that the U.S. will consider preemptive war when it seems like a good idea. Nevertheless, that's what they did. Democracy promotion is out. The strategy also jettisons the idea of democracy promotion, traditionally a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. One official said Sunday that economic relationships will guide the administration, while ultimately it's their choice in how states govern at home. What this persiflage means is difficult to say, but given the contradictions within the administration policy, it seems a mistake to seize on either part of this as representing what the present administration will do in days to come. The contradictions are replete. The document, however, is unfortunately clear on some other things. It is at odds with the longtime Pentagon recognition that climate change is a security problem. Climate change is not identified as a national security threat, one American official said, noting the new strategy was inspired by the president's speech in June that pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord. Earlier this year, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis told Congress that, quote, climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops are operating today, and military commanders need to incorporate drivers of instability that impact the security environment in their areas into their planning, close quote. What that bit of Pentagonese means is that it is a security problem, a defense problem, for the United States to pay attention to climate change. I'll give you one specific example why the Pentagon might be thinking about that these days. The revolt in Syria against President Assad that the Obama administration spent an immense amount of money hiring terrorists for, jihadists, to send into Syria to try to overthrow the Assad government. That revolt, which began locally within Syria, was prompted by a food crisis, bad harvests, climate change, and a popular complaint against the Assad government for not dealing with that problem was the starting point for this revolt that the Obama administration took over and tried to turn into a regime change war leading from behind, as Obama said, as they had in Ukraine. The Obama administration was particularly vigorous in trying to overthrow governments on the periphery of the Soviet Union. I've fallen into the language too. On the periphery of Russia, and Syria was occasioned by a climate crisis that produced bad harvests, a food crisis in Syria, and a revolt against the government. The confusion grows. We're at Aware on the Air today talking about the contradictions within the American government, not just between the war party and the Trump administration, since the Trump administration has taken on a good bit of the activities suggested by the American war party, by the neoconservatisms, but they're also quite remarkable oppositions between the leading neocon proposals for more war in the world at large and the Trump administration's activities. It's a particularly murky picture. It's worthwhile paying attention to some of these contradictions. The comment by the British reporter and political writer Claude Cockburn before the Second World War seems to me to be appropriate. Believe nothing until it's officially denied. So when the U.S. denies what it's doing on these matters of war and peace, only then can it be believed. That's an unhappy lead-in to the next point. The U.S. Defense Secretary, James Mad Dog Mattis, General, has refuted claims that the U.S. is preparing for war on Iran after the stark raving mad U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, led a bizarre press conference in which she stated that Iran has armed Houthi fighters in Yemen and thus violated the terms of the JCPOA. The JCPOA is the so-called Iran nuclear deal. So it takes, you can't tell the players within a program. It takes a while to explain who's saying what here. But Nikki Haley, this madwoman that the U.S. uses as a representative in the UN, begins the week by saying, well, the vicious war that the Saudis are carrying on against Yemen is justifiable because the Houthi people in Yemen are being armed by Iran, and that's a violation of the Iran nuclear deal. If you can't follow these threads, you are not alone. The important point here is what James Mattis, the Defense Secretary, General Mattis, said in response to this nonsense. Haley did not provide any evidence to substantiate her claims, but the interesting point is that Mattis said that the U.S. was preparing. It is confusing, believe me. Forgive my confusion. It's hard to get it clear, in part because what Mattis said was directly opposed to what the American representative of the United Nations said. Of the two, Mattis seems possibly the more sane, even though his nickname is Mad Dog, because he denied that the U.S. was preparing for war against Iran because of the war that the U.S. was supporting in Yemen. It's a particularly vicious situation. Yemen is surrounded by a Saudi naval blockade, and the U.S. is supporting that blockade, that terrorism against the people of Yemen, and the U.S. is justifying it to some extent, at least to the extent of Nikki Haley, by saying, well, Iran is supporting the Houthi people, therefore it's okay for Saudi Arabia to exterminate them. Interestingly, support for the Saudi extermination campaigns in Yemen seems to be very thin in the United States, and the results may lessen that vicious situation. You're watching Aware on the Air, and I want to conclude tonight with a piece by Stephen Cohen. Stephen Cohen is a professor of Russian Studies emeritus at Princeton and New York University. He writes in the Nation publication, not just because he's married to the editor of the Nation, but because he's been saying serious things about American-Russian relationships for a long time. And his comments on the Russiagate nonsense. Russiagate is the assertion that Putin was behind Trump's victory as president, and that Trump's dealings with the president of Russia amount to treason, and therefore Trump, should be removed as president of the United States. It's just that silly. Despite a lack of evidence at its core and the risk of nuclear conflagration as its byproduct, Russiagate remains the go-to accusation for getting the Trump administration, says Russia scholar Stephen F. Cohen. The foundational accusation of Russiagate, the basis, was and remains charges that Russian President Putin ordered the hacking of Democratic National Committee emails and their public dissemination through WikiLeaks in order to benefit Donald Trump and undermine Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election, and that Trump and or his associates colluded with the Kremlin in this, quote, attack on American democracy, close quote. When you summarize it, it sounds just as mad as it is. As no actual evidence for these allegations has been produced, after nearly a year and a half of media and government investigations, we're left with Russiagate without Russia. An apt formulation, perhaps first coined in an email exchange by Nation writer James Carden. Special Counsel Mueller has produced 4 indictments against retired General Michael Flynn, Trump's short-lived national security advisor, and George Papadopoulos, a lowly and inconsequential Trump advisor, for lying to the FBI, and against Paul Manafort and his partner Rick Gates for financial improprieties. None of these charges has anything to do with improper collusion with Russia, except for the wrongful insinuations against Flynn. Instead, the several investigations desperate to find actual evidence of collusion has spread to, quote, contacts with Russia, close quote, political, financial, social, etc., even including Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate for president, for having dinner in Moscow at a table that included the president of Russia. The unprecedented, preposterous, and dangerous, potentially more so, this is unprecedented, preposterous, and dangerous, potentially more so than even Joe McCarthy's search for communist connections in the 1950s. It would suggest, for example, that scores of American corporations doing business in Russia today are engaged in criminal enterprises. More to the point, advisors to U.S. policymakers and even media commentators on Russia must have many and various contacts with Russia if they're to understand anything about the dynamics of Kremlin policymaker. I myself, writes Stephen Cohen, to take an individual example, was an advisor to 2 unsuccessful presidential campaigns, that is, American presidential campaigns, which considered my wide-ranging and long-standing contacts with Russia to be an important credential, as did the one sitting president whom I advised. Cohen, who is a critic of the Russiagate nonsense, has been advising presidents and presidential candidates for a good while as a Russian scholar. To suggest that such contacts are in any way criminal is to slur hundreds of reputations and to leave U.S. policymakers with advisors laden with ideology and no actual expertise. It's also to suggest that any quest for better relations with Russia, or détente, is somehow suspicious, illegitimate, or impossible, as expressed recently by Andrew Weiss in the Wall Street Journal and by the Washington Post in an editorial. You can't talk to Russians. This is one reason why I have, in a previous commentary, argued that Russiagate and its promoters have become the gravest threat to American national security. Maybe that's what the CIA and Pompeo were trying to roll back this past week. Russiagate began sometime prior to June 2016, not after the presidential election in November, as is often said, as an anti-Trump political project. Smear Trump with the notion that he is somehow treasonously involved with Russia. Exactly why, how, and by whom Russiagate arose remains unclear, and herein lies the real significance of the largely bogus dossier and the still murky role of top U.S. intel officials in the creation of that document. This was the account, this was the dossier that supposedly revealed Trump's activities in Russia as being finally treasonous. That said, the mainstream American media have been largely responsible for inflating, perpetuating, and sustaining the sham Russiagate as the real political crisis it has become, arguably the greatest in modern American presidential and thus institutional political history. The media have done this by increasingly betraying their own professed standards of verified news reporting and balanced coverage, even resorting to tacit forms of censorship by systematically excluding dissenting reports and opinions. Still worse, this mainstream malpractice has spread to some alternative media publications, once prized for their journalistic standards, where expressed disdain for evidence and proof in favor of allegations without any actual facts can sometimes be found. nor are these practices merely the ordinary occasional mishaps of professional journalism. We have too many examples perhaps to discuss. I will place the rest of Stephen Cohen's article on the Facebook page for Aware, Aware of Champaign-Urbana, where you can read his account of how this Russiagate nonsense had got out of hand. It seems to be coming apart this week. That's very interesting and not necessarily hopeful. The forces in American politics that produced Russiagate nonsense in the first place may simply redouble their efforts after this strange involvement of the CIA and the warning to Russia of a terrorist threat to St. Petersburg. You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 51st week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. See No's notes on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and on the new archive of Urbana Public Television programs, which is remarkably extensive and detailed. You can see all some 440 editions of Aware on the Air. Do see the Facebook page for Aware for the articles that I've referred to tonight, and a link to the anti-war teach-in that Aware recently sponsored, prepared for television by the omnicompetent Jason Liggett. Finally, Nicholson Baker's Why I Am a Pacifist, The Myth of a Good War, is on that same Facebook page for Aware. I recommend it highly. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mendel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.